Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Roopa Dhatt. Welcome to this Women in Dev panel discussion on equitable relationships between donors and grantees. Thank you to Women in Dev for having me and for organizing today's session, and a special thanks to all of our speakers who you will be hearing from shortly. So Women in Dev is a platform to connect and unite women working at all levels and across all regions in the international development, global health, and social justice sectors to transform funding practices, advance women's leadership, and instill feminist leadership models within global institutions. The first Women in Dev conference was held at the beginning of 2020, and since then, we have been working closely with our partners and allies to change the way the sector operates. Dialogues such as this one are critical for getting the right people and organizations around the table to start building a blueprint for more equitable practices in this space. Again, I am Dr. Roopa Dhatt. I'm a part of the Women in Dev Steering Committee, but I'm also the co-founder and executive director of Women in Global Health. We are a global movement with the largest network of women and allies working to challenge power and privilege for gender equity and health. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I'm so excited to be joined by this incredible panel of women to discuss the important topic of equitable relationships between donors and grantees. However, as we kick off today's discussion, it is really critical to highlight this is all in the backdrop of the biggest threat to gender equality progress, the COVID-19 pandemic. The silent pandemic of gender inequities between and within societies is growing. Women are disproportionately facing the brunt of the pandemic, including women's livelihoods have taken a major hit. Women have lost more than 54 million jobs, and 1 in 5 women report in many countries losing their job. Before the pandemic, only a quarter of women had access to comprehensive social protections. And even when we take a look at the cash relief programs that are being utilized around the world during COVID-19, only 17% of women versus 27% of men have had access to these cash relief programs. Women have had increased care responsibilities, forcing them to leave the workplace at times. We also have heard the alarming rates of increased gender-based violence. And in low resource settings, girls are being pulled out of school to support families. We are at risk of losing generations of women unless we act now and support women and girls. Yet we know overseas development assistance is being reduced in many of these settings. To frame our discussion on gender equitable relationships between donors and grantees, I'd like to make 4 key points on equitable relationships between donors and grantees. 1, we need to get more funding into the hands of women's and grassroots organizations, especially women from underrepresented backgrounds, women of color, Black women, immigrant women, women based in lower middle income countries, those that are often the furthest from the nexus of power. 2, we need to trust grantees who have lived experiences and expertise. 3, we need to ensure funding is driven by local priorities. And 4, remove barriers to access funding. To give you some high-level stats on what we're dealing with, currently less than 1% of development assistance for gender equality goes to women's organizations and gender equality NGOs. Furthermore, the recent AWOD and Malma Cash report showed only half of women's NGOs have funding the following year. Second, to have sustainable impact and trust-based investment is critical. Grassroots women's organizations are at the front line of driving change, not only at COVID-19, but in general, they are the most powerful catalyst for gender equality. They know their needs, they know their communities, they are the experts, yet due to racism, classism, and other isms, donors rarely trust them or fund their work. 3, now it is time to walk the talk. It's time to increase investments and put systems into place where funding is responsive and driven by local priorities. Donors must trust and invest in those with lived experiences. The most powerful catalysts for gender equality are the women in their communities, yet large donors are paying those in power without lived experience to design policies and programs instead of trusting those who are the closest to work. This must change. 4th, philanthropy needs a full makeover to shift power to those with expertise of their own needs, where grantees, especially girls and women, are at the center of deciding what the funding priorities are, dictating the terms of grants, and coming up with their own impact measures. To do this, we must first and foremost remove systemic barriers. Donor and grantee relationships and structural inequities within the development sector is an increasingly highly charged topic, from accusations of power imbalances based on gender, race, and other isms within funding practices and narratives, to many organizations reassessing their internal prejudice and institutional inequalities. So, how do we ensure equitable funding practices and donor-grantee relationships? What could or should that even look like? And and what are the ongoing issues today that we need to address in order to get there. So today we have speakers working from donor organizations, grantee organizations, those in between, because this is a conversation that concerns all of us across the sector. I'm very excited to be hearing from each of the inspiring women here today, but I'll leave it to them to introduce themselves. So let's start with Anna Marie.
Thanks so much, Roopa. It's really a pleasure to be here. So my name's Anna Marie Harling. I'm Director and Lead of Philanthropic Collaboration at Co-Impact. And Co-Impact is a global collaborative for systems change, and we're focusing on intersectional gender justice across the Global South, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks Anna Marie. Next to Janelle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Janelle Kavanaugh. I'm with Global Fund for Women, and our vision is a world where movements for gender justice have transformed power and privilege for a few into equity and equality for all.
Thanks, Janelle. Linda, to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really honored to share the virtual stage with all of you amazing women leaders today. My name is Linda Weissert. I'm Director for Strategic Engagement and Communications at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIF in short. We work exclusively to support and transform the lives of children and adolescents and youth with a growing focus on girls and young women. And I lead our global gender advocacy, meaningful youth engagement portfolio. I also oversee a new initiative focused on mainstreaming equity, anti-racism, and solidarity-centered approaches across our grant making.
Thanks, Linda. And turning to you, Sankara.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us. I'm Sankara Caroline. I work with Akili Dada, an African-based leadership incubator. Our mission and vision is to see a lot more women and girls sitting in leadership positions across the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Sankara. And Uma, turning to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Uma. And among other things, I'm also a Women in Dev steering committee member, but I'm the initiator and lead facilitator for the Racial Equity Index. We are a BIPOC group of global development workers who have all experienced racism in global development and are working to build the first ever index for racial equity in global development.
Exciting, Uma. So now let's just get straight to the questions, because there's just so much I want to ask all of you. So I'm going to start with Sankara. Given your experience working with a variety of donors to fund amazing work for women's leadership in Kenya and elsewhere in East Africa, what would you say are the current flaws in traditional funding practices? What does an equitable funding relationship look like to you, especially as we really think about reaching women based in lower middle income countries and women-led organizations?
Thank you. That's a very heavy question. I hope I have a heavy response. So three things. The first thing is a lack of centric and sectoral funding. So you will find that in the space of development of our development world, a majority of the funding tends to be more heavily around certain fields or rather certain thematic spaces and not others. And that is something that is really beginning to friction with the progress and acceleration of a lot of progress that has already been achieved by a lot of organizations. Then secondly is learnings. You know, we donors and the funding space is not willing to invest in measuring feedback and investing in feed forwarding. You know, so we do not have a lot of studies that are looking into things and matters and aspects of society that have continued to affect a lot of people, you know, young women, young girls, older women, even older girls. So this is not a space that a lot of us, or rather a lot of donors, are willing to spend money on, yet you know, the expectation is that we have innovations. So without really investing in the R&D, we are not able to really speak to any forms or types of innovations. Then lastly, is a lack of feminist funding, you know, and the issue with feminism, you know, again, is an issue that has been surrounded by a lot of speculation all the way from, you know, and quite honestly, it's not really separated from the rise of other isms. So that's also, you know, a misgiving in itself. But then There's a lot of lack of inclusivity within the space. And, quite specifically speaking towards women in dev, if you think about it, about 50% of women, make half the population of the world. Yet the entire population of the world is made by 100% women. So if we're not really looking into spaces like that and making sure that we're investing in lived experiences, then really we are not giving to spaces or giving into areas or pockets that can really yield change and solutions. What I do think that is very much required and is very absent is, a key say concentration onto what really is the problem, because we have been getting funding for a very long time, not only Africa, Europe, Asia, everywhere across the world. So fundraising has become about money. Investments have been sent, huge organizations, huge corporations, but then why are we still not seeing changes? So we are not really asking the right questions, and we are not willing to invest in the right solutions, or even invest in the right, whether it's the paradigms of thought or even the mindsets or the mind shifts. So that's my long, answer to your long question. But then I'm sure as we continue to have conversations on this call today, we are really going to hopefully come down to what the solution really is. Thank you.
Yeah, Sankara, you touch on a lot of things, especially, raising this point that there is this pressure for innovation, yet we don't see the investments really going into create those innovations, especially on R&D. You talked about the lack of inclusivity and really bringing in people from lived experiences, and especially women, who you highlighted create 100% of the world's population. I wanted you to just elaborate a little bit more, if you were to make that case of why we need women with lived experiences driving this agenda, what would you say?
I would say that one of the reasons why we need women is because a majority of the misgivings of fundraising or funding or implementation at the grassroots level, the burden of that always lies on the woman within any society, whether it's a developed society or an underdeveloped society. So that's one of the cases that I would make for that. The other case I would make for that is because a majority of women who are in hard to reach populations are still the women who are being left behind. So women in city centers, or even women in spaces that are closer to the capital, they know where to get solutions. What you need to do there is accelerate. For a majority of the greatest say whether it's harmful practices, whether it's early marriage, early childhood marriage, whether it's FGM, whether it's gender-based violence, many of the women who do not know what to do or where to find the solutions are sitting in hard to reach populations. So when you impact one woman, the model of peer-to-peer, say peer-to-peer models have been proven to be able to really cascade quite a lot of givings towards society, whether it's economic empowerment or social empowerment. So my case for the woman is that the woman is the centerpiece, she's the center stage. She is the epicenter of society. So if we're not really investing in the woman and allowing the woman to be able to take charge, whether it is through, giving them bodily autonomy, allowing them to be able to rise to their own rights, and allowing them to really be able to rise to creating solutions that, one, they have proven, and those that they haven't even proven. So a majority of the time, you'll find that a lot of donors, they want to do that through organizations that really do not understand the grassroots. So if you do not make funding women-centric, if you do not make it female-centric, then really you will continue funding. It's going to be a pocket that continues to receive, but then the solutions will continue to be so far apart. And really, the world really needs to move away from funding things that are mediocre. I think it's time.
Thank you for raising those points, Sankara, and you really touched on what it means to also start creating that inclusive environment. You said putting women at the center, and if we don't start doing that and also looking at models that are proven, peer-to-peer models, then we're going to keep putting funding into places that are not effective. And we'll be coming back more to this, and I want to actually turn next to Anna Marie. Co-Impact acts as sort of an intermediary, being a donor collaborative, but also working close with grantees. You get a unique perspective into both sides of philanthropy. So I'd love to hear from you. What work is currently being done to make philanthropy more equitable? How would you say the donor-grantee relationship is evolving from the perspective of donors?
Yeah, thanks so much, Roopa and Sankara. Just to say here to everything you said, that was so beautifully put. So Yeah, as a donor collaborative, so we're pooling funding from philanthropists and foundations, and then it's our team that's sourcing, selecting, and supporting predominantly women-led Global South organizations to transform those systems to be more just and inclusive and advance women's power, agency, and leadership at all levels. So I think firstly, just to kind of put the question of making philanthropy more equitable is really about us acknowledging the power dynamics between those with funds and those looking for funds. And I think as funders, we really need to reflect on how we show up and make conscious steps to address the power dynamic. I do think, overall big picture that there are initiatives around trust-based philanthropy and growing critiques of big philanthropy. So there is a growing interest here, but I have to say that I've been working with philanthropists for over the past decade, and there's still a long way to go. I think at Co-Impact, we really are trying to make philanthropy more equitable in a number of different ways. Sankara, you touched on this point of like listening to, the people who are really doing the work. And so it's very much a value of ours to kind of bring out a beginner's mindset and really listen to, the grassroots leaders, the NGO leaders, the activists and experts across the sector, acknowledging that everyone plays this key role and brings an invaluable experience. And actually within the development of the Gender Fund, we undertook a year-long consultation process with over 50 gender experts and feminist leaders, which have really kind of informed the approach of the Gender Fund. And then I think within the grant making, we actually take what we call a program partner centric approach, and we specifically call our partners program partners and not grantees, because part of this is also signaling that this is an equal partnership, and that is, our stance is really to kind of get behind our program partners' vision for change. We've seen too many cases where a partner is feeling very pressured to implement a funder's vision for change of what is needed or necessary, and that may not be what's actually relevant or needed in the relevant context of where the partner is working. And then this approach really runs across the entirety of our grant sourcing, our due diligence, and the support we provide. We're actually just about to launch an open call for our country level work, and these grants are going to be 100% to organizations based in the Global South. At least 75% of those organizations will be led by women. We're doing, very much open sourcing because we really want to get it out as much as possible. So, for a call to everybody that sees like the call for concept notes going out next week, please spread them to your networks. This is really about kind of acknowledging and encouraging those local organizations to apply. We've also been really thoughtful about how do you consider language equity, both in terms of like the availability of different languages for the open call, how people submit concept notes in different languages, and hosting very open access webinars in different time zones to allow everybody to participate. Then when it comes to grants, I think we've spoken about the need for, significant multi-year unrestricted grants. I think that's really important. I think we also, Sankara, you touched on also around the learning, measurement, evaluation, like what is working. Like it's up to the organizations to define what is it that they need to measure to know what is actually working in their context, and how do we think about what is the relevant evidence. Within the Gender Fund itself, we're actually carving out a piece to actually provide grants for research in terms of what is actually working, and not research that is flown in, but research that's really needed by practitioners and is local and proximate to where the work is being done. And then as we go through the grant, it's really about ensuring that the program partner is in the driving seat, both in terms of the support they need from us, and I think simple things such as saying that in our check-ins, like the agenda should be substantially driven by the partner and not necessarily by us. And I think Sankara, Roopa, you both mentioned it, this idea of really building trust in the relationship with the program partner. As I said, we're a funder collaborative, so it's very important that our co-impact funders also share these values. And I do think a lot of the role of my team particularly is to actually have these conversations with funders and ensure that, people that come in and want to fund collaboratively together through co-impact really kind of share these values, and that's kind of really key to our approach. And I will stop there. A lot more we can say, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Anna-Marie. That was very refreshing to hear how grantee-centered the process is, and some of the very tangible ways that Co-Impact is doing is that knowing that the next process of grants that you'll be opening up is going to be 100%, really focused on getting into Global South, LMICs, and having opportunities for women. That's really exciting to hear. So everyone tuning in, do look out for that opportunity. I also found it interesting that you really looked at all different levels, first by beginning by listening to those that are most effective by these issues, but then also really looking at even, the everyday ways of how power dynamics are defined, setting the agenda, who sets the agenda, or, how even the reporting and research is done, that it's locally driven. I think this is really important that you're really touching on the sort of micro ways that influence the macro power relations. And I wanted to turn it back to you really quickly. You touched upon the fact that your organization really turns to doing extensive research. How do you make sure that the findings you're having also are benefiting those that you are consulting? Because we often see, and this is something that I can say, we even at Women in Global Health face, we've been part of pretty extensive consultations, and then you never hear back, or you never know how those consultations are really changing the donor landscape. So it'd be great to hear from you in ways that you're using that listening and research exercise to also really benefit those that have contributed to this work.
Yeah, 100%. So one of the things that was really important to us as we kind of finalized the consultation process and before we actually announced the fund at the Generation Equality Forum was to have a round table where we actually invited all of those that had actually participated in the process to say, this is overall what we heard, and this is what we're taking on board. We actually also published, it's available on our website, a report about that, like what did we hear, what were we listening, and how has the fund developed as a result of that. I think a key part is really just being open and sharing. In terms of kind of the research grants that we'll be making, like one of the key things that we're looking for, have been looking for, we're just going through some of the RFPs right now, is that link to say, how are you as a research institution ensuring that your research is relevant to practitioners? Who are your partners? Who are you listening to? Who's telling you that this is actually important work to be done and researched? And so that's part of kind of the assessment that we're actually going through right now as we assess those concept notes.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Anne-Marie. And as part of the resources that are sent out, I encourage us to take a look at what you've learned in your learning journey in the last few months. So I'd like to turn, Linda, to you now. How would you like to respond to what you're hearing so far, given SIF's own journey with equity-focused grant making? And what are some insights and learnings would you like to share in terms of what it takes to shift funding practices?
Thanks so much, Roopa. And yeah, I would just like to thank Sankara and Anna-Marie for their excellent contributions and echoing a lot of what they have just outlined. So at SIF, we've been on a journey towards building our understanding of what it takes to implement truly gender transformative and equity-focused approaches to grant making. And the emphasis is on journey. We still have a long way to go, but I'm also very encouraged by the changes we've been able to implement so far. So in terms of what we've learned, I want to focus on the what and the how, especially the how to drive this agenda internally. So first, in terms of the what, as a foundation, we've always been about solving systemic issues that children, and in particular, girls and young women face in their everyday lives. But fundamentally, we've learned that this requires us to change three things. One is really to prioritize integrated systemic interventions that center girls and their needs holistically, which is a point that Sankara made, and that can address multiple issues symbiotically. So, across health, nutrition, education, sexual reproductive health and rights, and climate change. The second is to be specific about reaching those that, due to their race, their education, their socioeconomic background, face multiple levels of inequity and have often been left behind. And then the third is about being intentional to shift power to those who are best placed to design contextual solutions to the challenges that girls face. And in many cases, if not all, it means shifting power from traditional development partners and structures in the so-called global north to those who are truly on the front lines of the fight against poverty and discrimination, that historically have been undervalued and underfunded. And you mentioned, for example, women's organizations still only receiving 1% of global funding on gender equality. So all of these principles are becoming key pillars of our work, including within our new strategy for programming in Africa, which is very exciting. At the same time, I think we're still grappling with, how to translate these principles into practice. And it includes conversations around, one, how do you operationalize the shift in power? What are the structural implications, right, of how the shift can practically happen from us as a funder to our partners, from partners to sub-partners, within partner organizations. The other thing is about measuring impact. So shifting power will also require us to look differently at what impact we measure, how we measure it, and systemic and locally driven solutions need time and flexibility to materialize, right? We know that many measurement and evaluation frameworks, including those that we ourselves have used in the past, are often focused on assessing shorter term vertical impacts. And then the third question we're grappling with is around scale. So recent discussions in the development sector have highlighted sort of the inherent biases of funders working with bigger, more established INGOs, as they are seen to be better at delivering at scale. But at the end of the day, what we have learned is that truly sustainable interventions are those that are eventually integrated into government systems, and no partner can deliver change at scale by itself. So we really need to rethink the way in which we deliver interventions, and really being intentional about funding a wider ecosystem of all sorts of partners rather than banking on one alone. Just one other thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is the how, specifically how to drive these changes internally. And I've learned 5 things in particular. The first one is to recognize that, this can be a complex and long process, and change won't always be linear. The second is really to focus on not just policies and processes within philanthropy, but also influencing values and culture and leadership behaviors. The third one, Sankara and Anna-Marie outlined, that is to learn from those who are already doing the work. And then the last 2, one is to be intentional about building support and buy-in across all levels of your organization. And then for non-rights-based funders, it's about showing that equity is not just the right thing to do, which it is, but it will also make philanthropic giving much more meaningful and more impactful and sustainable. So yeah, all of these learnings, I think, have shown me that, what it really takes is a village, as the saying goes, those working inside and outside of philanthropy to drive change and exert pressure when needed.
Linda, I really liked how you provided such a comprehensive, approach to the journey that you guys are on at SIF. And I'd like to ask you just an immediate follow-up is, where are you seeing, most of the challenges? You kind of alluded to the cultural change and the how being an area, but yeah, where do you see the greatest, barriers to implementing these values, the what?
I mean, it is about a mindset shift, right? It is about a cultural shift in how development and development aid has traditionally been delivered. And I think it is very important for funders or for certain funders, because many are already on that journey and way ahead, to actually move from being too directive to being actively listening to their partners and those that are delivering change on the ground for the communities we serve. And so, yeah, that requires a change in perspective and just a change in the ways of doing things, as Anna-Marie and Sankara have outlined.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, resistance in the mindset. And I think it was also interesting how in the how you pointed out, one area is not to just talk about equity as the or having an equity approach is the right thing to do, but that actually leads to more meaningful philanthropy. So we'll want to come back to this on, ways that you actually can make the case and convince those that are resistant and changing their mindset. So I'd like to turn next to Uma, actually. So, it's been so great to hear the perspective so far. After all, we're all striving for the same end goal. We've just have different roles to play in the bigger picture sector. But I want to turn to you, Uma, now. Your work at the Racial Equity Index is just incredible. It explores persistent inequities that go internally within the development sector and specifically on racial inequalities. How do you see racism and sexism still permeating the sector and funding practices, and how can we do better?
This is a huge question, so I'm going to try to be succinct. I want to say that racism and sexism permeate the sector, but the sector has been built upon reifying and upholding white, cis, heteronormative patriarchy. So racism and sexism permeate the sector, but the sector was built on upholding those principles. And funding practices and the donor-grantee relationship has been built upon upholding those principles. So the system isn't broken, it was built that way. And we need to be really clear about the fact that we are operating in this system that was specifically designed to uphold these inequities. With the Racial Equity Index, we are a group of all BIPOC people, and within the international global development landscape, we have our collective is global, and we have made it our mission to really look at the impacts of racial equity and the impacts of the lack of racial equity within global development, and really how it affects BIPOC people within the sector specifically. And so we had sent out this global mapping survey in early January. We sent it out to as many people as possible. We partnered with over 30 different organizations so that we could really ask, what are the indicators? What are the things that you look at when we look at racial equity within global development? And what are your experiences of racism or either witnessing racism within global development? We had close to 800 responses and in 10 different languages. Mind you, we are all volunteers. We are all volunteers doing this, and our work is independently peer reviewed multiple times at every single stage. Yet 32% of our survey respondents identified as white female. So it's interesting, like when we got these responses back, even though our target focus was really wanting to hear from BIPOC folks, the overwhelming response was from people who identified as white female. So it really highlights the fact that the global development sector is still so, the majority voices are still the voices of white women, which is problematic because, as we know, and as many activists have said, white women are the upholders of cis white heteronormative patriarchy. And so when white women are placed within these leadership positions, and we've seen this in the reckonings of global development organizations, when they're the CEOs, when they're the EDs, when they're the COOs, and they're reifying such harmful racial violence against their BIPOC staff and consultants, what does that say about then the work that they're doing, right? That the work that the organizations are doing. And additionally, what does it say then about the funders who continue to support organizations that literally harm BIPOC people in global development? And so in this global mapping survey, what we found really interesting is that, there were the four top organizations where survey respondents noted experiencing and witnessing racism. Definitely INGOs was the top, but private sector organizations and then funder organizations where they said that they noted experiencing and witnessing racism. And in terms of we are still finishing the complete analysis of this survey. Again, we are all volunteers, so we move through this work really intentionally. But what is interesting in this data analysis process for the qualitative data is that respondents shared remembering experiences that were blocked out. So a lot of the BIPOC respondents, shared that they remembered these experiences, but they had blocked them out because it's so pervasive, right? You experience racial violence on Monday, you go back to work on Tuesday and you experience it again and again and again and again. This is a never-ending perpetual cycle that BIPOC people in global development have to go through. And what is interesting is that it is an indication of the survival tactic that is literally required to function within the global development sector. And it's staggering, as BIPOC folk ourselves that are doing this work as volunteers, reading the experiences of other BIPOC folks talking about their experiences of racism in global development. Like, we've had to take a lot of mental health days to just even process the fact that people are moving through this, you know, and this is their day-to-day existence. So what does it mean? What does it mean for a global development sector when we are here saying that we are here to fight for women's rights, we're here to fight for racial equity, we're here to fight for human rights, but yet we are harming the very people who are actually trying to push this work forward? What does it mean when funders are willing to look the other way and not actually hold the organizations that they fund accountable for the harm that they cause to BIPOC staff, and not even staff, right? We're talking about, you know, consultants, we're talking about people who are not salaried because organizations in the global north refuse to salary a lot of workers that are in the global south. And so there are perpetual inequities in the funding landscape. And I think, you know, it's important to note that while I'm talking about the global development landscape, all of what we're looking at in terms of our research feeds into how funding principles and the relationship between donor and grantees continues to perpetuate racism and sexism. You know, because of the fact that the system is built upon an inequitable power dynamic that is rooted in white cis heteronormative patriarchy. And so when we're looking at the funder landscape and the donor-grantee relationship, we're looking at issues, and these are some of the subcodes that came up in the survey responses in terms of the challenges that people have with funders is white exceptionalism. So the concept that white people believe that they are exempt from white supremacy, that they're one of the good ones because they work in global development, right? They're trying to do the good work rather than being directly responsible for perpetuating and upholding systems of white supremacy. We're looking at things like reckless aid, allocating grants without building relationships with local community, Western superiority, assuming that the funder organization that are white-led, that are in the West or expat-led, you know, have somehow less likely issues with corruption or mismanagement of funds or issues that carry through from the results of global development. You know, we're looking at, you know, so many things in terms of even in terms of Western superiority, the idea that somehow Western-led funder organizations know what is best for those that are actually doing the work and that are impacted by the issues. So this question, the second question, in terms of how we can do better, it's not just about listening, it's about trust, period. It is about trust. Trust the work that is being done by the communities, trust our solutions, trust our work, trust our lived experiences. What I find really interesting as a facilitator for the Racial Equity Index is we have all experienced racism in global development. None of us is arriving at this work, you know, not having been affected from a mental perspective, from a psychological perspective of the ongoing everyday racial violence that we experience working in global development. And yet somehow we have been told that even though our work is peer reviewed, that we carry bias within our work. Of course we carry bias. We are a group of BIPOC-led, you know, gender diverse people that are moving through global development day in and day out, working to build an accountability system to hold the global development sector accountable for racial equity. So of course we're biased. We cannot remove the bias from the work that we do, but somehow our lived experiences are not trusted in the work that we're doing. I think just two more things. One, you know, don't impose your agenda as a funder on already marginalized and racialized groups that are doing the work, and fund all aspects of the work. It remains, you know, I've worked in the women's rights space for a long time. It remains such an interesting point for me that even in 2021, we're talking about women's rights and human rights and racial equity as if they are siloed issues. They are all interconnected. They are all intersectional. So why are we funding things, you know, that affect one group of people here and one group of people here, and not recognizing that when we're talking about racial equity, literally this is a women's rights issue. Literally this is a human rights issue. So why are we segregating the funding from those experiences? I will stop there because I can't keep on going.
Uma, there's just so much to what you said, and I have to just, you know, say thank you for being just honest. I know it takes courage. It takes a toll to talk about all those experiences you're talking about, not just for yourself, but other BIPOC people. And the fact that you guys have done this racial equity survey, it needs to be funded, this work, and I think that's my shout out to all the donors that are tuning into this, or others that want to contribute. But too often this kind of work does not get the funding, but it is so critical to really keeping us informed, but also keeping us accountable. And Uma, there is one question that's really coming in that I want you to quickly answer, because I think it is a really important one. Tweaking systems is one thing, but how do you create an alternative system or dismantle this one? You started with talking about how currently the donor landscape has been built in a way, and therefore the foundation of it is not a broken one, but it is one of an exploitative one. Can you give an example of a situation where a system has been dismantled and we're seeing the transformation that you are calling for? From a personal belief, I don't think that, when a system has been around for hundreds and hundreds and literally hundreds of years, right? And the systemic effects of colonialism and neocolonialism are continue to impact us on a day-to-day basis. You cannot dismantle a system like that. What you can try to do, what we are trying to do at the Racial Equity Index, is to hold that system accountable. And I think in so many different ways with so many grassroots organizations, that's exactly what they are trying to do as well. To really pressurize or apply pressure, sorry, I'm using the wrong language, to apply pressure to funders in how they move through this landscape and how they show up, because it's 2021. It is beyond time. Like, we shouldn't even have to be having these conversations. It is beyond time to understand that these accountability mechanisms that we're trying to produce at the Racial Equity Index are overdue, that they are overdue, and that we are not looking to dismantle a system that was never designed for us, right? Nor are we looking to build a new system, because systems are always oppressive in so many different contexts, right? What we are trying to do is call for accountability. Yeah, so I think this question, I'd like to also, just ask our donors on the call to reflect on, because it is also very much about holding your own organizations accountable. And one of the questions has come in about how are funders holding themselves in their grant making process accountable to systemic racism. We're going to come to that question in a moment, but I want to hear, next from Janelle. Janelle, I know you're going to have a lot to contribute to this conversation. Given Global Fund for Women identifies as a feminist funder, I'd love to know how Global Fund for Women integrates its feminist values into grant making. We've talked about how less than 1% of gender-focused aid has gone to women-led organizations in recent years. What can be done to bring institutions' grant-making models closer to the approaches used by women's funds, such as Global Fund for Women?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think in order to answer that question, I'm going to talk about it kind of in 4 different ways. First, I want to start with, what is a women's fund? And then what are the feminist philanthropy principles that are an important part of women's funds? And specifically, how does that play out in grant making? And then I'll give you some examples of work at Global Fund for Women. So what is a women's fund? It's basically a public fundraising foundation that works with grassroots women and girls and trans people. We provide financial and other resources for social justice and human rights for women. Women's funds can be regional, they can be local, or like ourselves at Global Fund for Women, we're global. Most of us, we really abide by what we call the feminist philanthropy principles, which are an important part of our work. And people have been talking about it throughout this call, many of these attributes. But it starts with trust, right? And there's a saying that change happens at the speed of trust. And we find that really true. We need transparency. We need to have those sometimes difficult conversations respectfully and done with curiosity. And we need to engage each other as equals, from the donor to the organizational leader to the client. We should understand that we're all benefiting from the relationship. And of course, what's been talked about too is just understanding the power dynamics in the room that can often disrupt our ability to pursue our agendas. And, we've talked a lot about on this call too, but in feminist philanthropy, we really believe that change happens from the bottom up, and that those most impacted by the issues are the best place to figure out the solutions that are needed. So how does this play out in grant making? Well, the beauty of women's funds is that they are close to those most impacted. They have the relationships, they've been building the relationships over time, they have the trust, they fund directly at the grassroots level. And an example of this that we can really see right now is during a crisis. During a crisis, you really need to be funding those at the grassroots level who really need the support, that are often not in the big cities, et cetera. And we know that women are disproportionately affected during crisis, whether it be as they're the frontline healthcare workers or the increase in domestic violence. Women's funds are really poised especially at the local level, to fund quickly. And to have had those relationships prior to the crisis, so they know who to fund, where to fund, what the issues are, et cetera. But in grant making, we really also need to be thinking about shifting power, right? And that has a lot to do with giving unrestricted gifts, and thinking about using participatory grant making practices. And certainly, what was talked about earlier too is giving multi-year grants. When you think about it, if you're giving a one-year grant, you're really tying the hand of that leader. It's very difficult to strategize when you're constantly trying to fundraise, when you only have a one-year grant. So how are you going to hire staff to implement the work? So multi-year grants are really critical and crucial. And I'll just give you some examples at Global Fund for Women. We believe that long-term sustainable change happens through funding movements, grassroots, often women-led movements. And in our new strategic plan, we have a plan for how to implement this work and are really learning through our process. We talk about our process as a learning process. We don't do things, ever in error. It's a learning process, and we pivot and we change, et cetera. And we start our work in funding movements by doing a landscape analysis to really look at what's going on in the network, not just specific groups, but how is the network working? What are the relationships? Relationships are key to movement building. And then we want to really kind of seed power to this movement. So by creating what we call a movement committee of people in the network that helps determine everything from who gets funding in that network, from the funds that we have, how much they get, how they will evaluate their work. Anne-Marie talked earlier about the people closest to the issues deciding how to evaluate the work that they're doing, and that's part of this process. So some examples of the movements we're working on are things like abortion rights in East Africa, domestic workers' rights in India, girls' leadership and voice in Cameroon, and it's all really exciting work. And I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, Janelle, it was great to hear some of the themes that we've been hearing earlier in this chat about really trust, making sure there's multi-year funding, but also this unique model of the networks you're talking about and how those networks are really driving, setting the decision-making and shifting the power dynamics. And so I think there are a lot of good practices from Global Fund for Women that we all need to be tapping into. We're coming to the near end of this, and I am going to be coming back to each panelist, but I wanted to give the opportunity to Anne-Marie to see if you'd like to chime in on this question that came up during UMA's conversation, pretty much around, really what's the accountability that donor organizations are doing to address explicitly racism?
Yeah, so I think it's just the question we're talking about, funders shifting their mindsets and how we're getting there. Yes. And I think it's such a great question, and it's one we see in terms of like there is a body of voices. There are people out there understanding the issues that are putting their questioning, like, why is this happening? How is this happening? And I think we need to all be more vocal. I have to say, like, the reality, a lot of the philanthropists that we speak to are just not there yet. Like they don't even understand that there is an issue, right? So the question is, how can we get them to hear it? And I think it's not something that it's just one person having that conversation. They have to hear it from many, many different points of view. And I think if we're thinking about changing mindsets, it takes all of us constantly, putting forward the same message that it will eventually change. And it's not going to be, unfortunately it's not going to be quick. But I think the great thing about having these types of conversations is you do realize that there are groups that are getting there, that we are having those discussions, and all I can say is just encourage each and every one of us and everybody on the call to continue raising these questions and having that conversation. And certainly in the discussions that we have with our funders, like this becomes very central to it. Like, how do we show up? And even in our organization as Co-Impact, how do we show up as Co-Impact? We're often perceived as more of a global north organization. How are we shifting also our decision making and our equity more to our teams that are in Nairobi or in India? What is equity across the organization? So I think it starts very much also looking within, and then also kind of speaking out and saying, like, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, and just constantly just being out there and standing for that.
Yeah, so your message really on a lot of self-reflection, and then making sure that that story of self-reflection as you're on the learning journey gets shared. So as we come to this, last bit of the session, really a tough question for all of you, and I know it's really hard to do this, but please, share with us, what is one action that donors can do to make all of this much more equitable? From our audience, we're hearing, what should be the new social contract between donors and grantees? What is needed now? So I'm going to ask Sankara to kick us off. What's that one action that donors can do to be more equitable?
Yeah, you're right about it being a tough question there. But I think, first of all, allow me to say that I really loved everything that we have all said on this webinar, because I feel like if we have philanthropists listening on the call, really, it's very easy for you to see where to begin, and sort of even see the continuum of how to continue to scale whatever it is you picked up on. What I would like to call out for is a partnership of the goals. And what I mean by that is there's a good sense of donors wanting to fund a particular, say, thematic area and not necessarily plug into another area. And the truth is that without the partnership of all the goals, you really are doing a disservice to even the amount of money or even the effort, the intellectual resources, et cetera, that you're putting into anything. Because if you listen to all of us, we are all coming from different fields. We are all dealing with different challenges, but we are all in this globe together. So for us to really be able to make sure that we are achieving the milestones that long-term funding could achieve, the milestones that we require to tick off to make sure that we are mobilizing the proper mindsets, perceptions, et cetera, we all have to create proper collaboration. If we are not collaborating with regards to the problems, to the issues, to the solutions, to the innovations, the interventions, we really are not going to be able, whether it is to iterate or innovate or even pivot. So that's the one thing that I would really call out. And not only for the donors, but even for organizations that are using donor funding to, solve solutions and solve problems. We need to all collaborate and just ensure that the thought leadership is happening across board and not only for little tiny pockets of spaces across the world. Thank you.
That's great, Sankara. Also putting the challenge to all of us to really work in a collaborative and partnership way. Anne-Marie, to you.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, and apologies, my daughter, I think, just arrived home, if you can hear in the background. So I think for us, it really is this point, I think we all raised it in different ways, about putting those closest to the work at the center, understanding their vision, their need, what is the context they're operating in, not coming with like a very clear top-down technocratic view of what needs to be done. It's about really supporting those organizations and doing that in a way that's long-term, it's unrestricted, and it's really suitable to the needs of what they're trying to address. And I think if we can even just get there, with a lot of the the funders, then that would already solve not all the issues, but it would be such a step in the right direction.
Really appreciate that point about shifting the focus on the people most effective. Linda, to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, yes, I would echo sort of the mention of supporting local ownership, more flexible, longer term core funding, collaboration and systemic solutions. Maybe one thing to add, and that speaks more again to the values and the culture shifts that we need to see, is we have a responsibility to really unpack some of those current myths around where knowledge comes from, who holds expertise, what impact should look like. And I think all of us, you know, we are on a personal journey. We show up as people in our organizations, right? Organizations are not a monolith, they're made up of people, and all of us have a responsibility and a role to play in changing mindsets, and doing that work every day and showing up for it is actually paramount to then seeing the organizational change that we want to achieve. So that's my one recommendation.
Great one, Linda. You know, also our own individual responsibility in transforming the mindset and reminding us that organizations are made up of people. Uma, to you.
I want to just highlight a question that came from Olivia Andrews in terms of how do we get funders to accept that they're perpetrators of white supremacy without alienating them if they get offended? How do we strike the balance and not alienate all of our funders? And this question is hitting me hard because, you know, if for this one thing, the answer to your question, Roopa, it would, for me, you know, and I'm speaking now on a very personal level as a former executive director of Women's March Global, I was told multiple times I should hire a white development person for our organization to lead development conversations with funders because, you know, I was coming across as too opinionated or too difficult to work with. And I saw firsthand when we shifted over to a white leader for Women's March Global after I resigned, how quickly the funding conversation shifted and how quickly the funds were able to come in. And so my ask for funders would really be to understand the risk of reprisal that we face as people within the global development sector of speaking out about these issues. When we started our work at the Racial Equity Index, we were an anonymous group because we know that the global development sector is not ready to be held accountable for the immense lack of racial inequity in global development, you know, and the harm that has been caused to BIPOC people. We know this because the same organizations that were called out in last year's round of reckonings are still being funded by many funders. And so for funders, I would really ask them to understand the price that we have to pay in order to demand accountability for the systems that you choose to uphold.
Thank you, Uma, for picking up that question, and quite a critical one. And as a woman of color, also leading an NGO, I can relate so much. You know, we have that bias, and it's not enough to do bias training. We have to be much more intentional and really see it as the harm that you're talking about that weakens the entire sector. Just so much to unpack. And Janelle, you know, what's that one action that you would pick, complementing the others that donors can do to make this entire landscape more equitable?
I would say unrestricted funding. If you're going to trust a group enough to give them your money, then why are you restricting it?
Short and sweet and to the point and very loud and clear. I want to just also acknowledge there's so many incredible questions that were asked today. We unfortunately did not get the time to get to them, but we will be taking note of them. And this is just, you know, again, part of the series, part of the conversation. Women in Dev is committed to continuing these conversations. So we will be reflecting on those questions. I'll ask our panelists if they have a moment to type those answers, please do. But I want to thank all of you for tuning in, especially our speakers today, Women in Dev, for convening this conversation. What an enlightening and refreshing discussion, but also a really a point where we have to really inflect. You know, there's a lot discussed about transforming power and privilege, transforming those relationships. And these are not easy things to do. It truly is a journey. And the messaging of listening, learning, building trust came out clear. And there were some very concrete ways to transform this process. I hope that all of you that are tuning in, whether you're a donor, a grantee, part of the ecosystem, walked away with something and can really bring that change into your organization. It was so insightful to have both donors and grantee organizations represented today. In order to ensure true equity across the sector, we all need to unite in the shared values and ambitions to combine the donor resources with the grantees on the grounded knowledge of how these can be translated into tangible changes, to strive for equality as well as a united front and abolish outdated structures and power dynamics. A few key points to walk away with, and I want to again ground all of these discussions that we have truly an urgency. The global pandemic is challenging the rights and progress of girls and women around the world. So this is not an agenda that we can ignore. It's one that needs center focus. Money is important and cannot be negated, but more is needed. It is also about the deep-rooted attitudes, narratives that shape our practices, such as the role of grantee organizations as the helpless victim rather than the activists and change makers in their own right, or the closed-minded ideas of what expertise or leadership could look like. Second, women and girls are already leading the change, but we must ensure funding gets into their hands. This means engaging them in decision-making processes regarding resource allocation, removing barriers to access, and intentionally investing in grassroots organizations, especially those led by women. We heard loud and clear, multi-year funding, unrestricted funding. 3, philanthropy is shifting. New narratives and new trust-based funding practices, such as more flexible and accessible grants, lift smaller movements off the ground without overburdening or inflicting specific metrics, which may be counterproductive to the movement as a whole, are just some of the examples we heard about today. Next, donors and grantees often share the same goals and values, but there's ongoing gaps. Inequities and narratives still impact the way programs and grants are designed. Both donors and grantees must address these in order to evolve practices. And to all of you watching, what do equitable donor-grantee relationships and funding practices look like to you? Join the conversation by letting us know your thoughts on Women in Dev's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with any of our speakers and myself to just continue the dialogue as well. Stay tuned for more discussions on different topics and different formats every month. To all of you watching, what do equitable donor-grantee relations and funding practices look like to you? Let's keep this conversation going. It's not the end. And also look out for Women in Dev's podcast launching on Tuesday, 28 September with incredible Kavita Ramdas, who's going to be speaking on how we can make big global gender movements like the Generation Equality Forum more accountable, and why a post-COVID world must look different if we are to achieve an equitable future for all. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and let's continue to work together to transform our donor-grantee relationships and create much more equitable funding so it benefits everyone. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.